In many of the photos and the videos from the protests, you can see individuals wearing face masks, which is a little bit of an adjustment to protesting during a pandemic. But there's actually a major concern right now about coronavirus spikes from protests, with health officials that are asking protesters to not sing or shout. And the week, the head of the CDC said he's actually very concerned that protests could be seeding events that are going to lead to a new outbreak. And so New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio even said he wants people to get back to social distancing after having previously supported some peaceful gathering for protests.
So joining us now to discuss all of this is great friend of the show and co-founding editor of The Intercept and host of the fantastic show you all should be watching called System Update, the great Glenn Greenwald. Great to see you, sir.
Good to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you,
So we
Glenn.
should say our goal is to talk to you about coronavirus and the protests. Your goal is to make Sagar and I fight some more. So we're going to see whose priorities win out here.
I think we're going to win.
Maybe we can all win.
Yeah.
So Glenn, what do you make of sort of, it's almost like coronavirus is over, right? People are out in the streets. Public health officials are out, cheering the protesters in the street. What do you make of this dynamic?
Honestly, I find this shift in the discourse with no explanation very kind of disturbing, because for 3 months we were indoctrinated with the idea that it was a moral obligation, an absolute moral obligation for everyone to stay in their homes, to the point where anyone who went outside for any reason other than working in hospitals or out of necessity were shamed on social media, were often fined or arrested. There was this kind of dogma that said that there's nothing that justifies going outside, let alone gathering in crowds. And now all of a sudden, not only is gathering in crowds tolerable or permissible, it's being actively encouraged by oftentimes the very same people who just 10 days ago literally were treating it as an act of immorality. Now, maybe there's a good reason for that. And the only attempt I've heard to explain it is that, well, racism kills also, just like the coronavirus does. But that was the same argument that a lot of people on the right were using who are protesting lockdowns, which is, yes, coronavirus is dangerous and kills people, but so too do economic depressions. And that argument was deemed impermissible to even enter the discourse, let alone valid. So there's been no attempt to grapple with this extremely sudden and radical change in what we're hearing from our authorities about what our moral obligations as citizens are. And it strikes me as just kind of creepy and authoritarian, the way the population just instantly goes from acquiescing to one dictate to the other, even though they're exact opposites.
Yeah, Glenn, I mean, I'm certainly struck by the same thing. You saw, I think it was the New York City health commissioner who said, if coronavirus cases don't spike, don't blame lack of social distancing, blame racism. And it's exactly as you said. I mean, that is the core argument of what the lockdown protesters were arguing as well. And when you call it authoritarian, I mean, what do you owe that to? I mean, is it the media? Is it the public health officials themselves? And could you also just speak to the damage this will do to public health guidance overall? I mean, how are people who abided by these rules supposed to assess and feel now that they see them being flaunted by the people who were once enforcing them?
I mean, I think it goes to this deeper pathology in our discourse where any dissent now is pathologized instead of just engaged. So if you have a different opinion, if you deviate from the consensus, then it doesn't mean that your ideas should be engaged. It means that you personally ought to be denounced as a bad person. We saw that even with things like Russiagate, where anybody who was questioning the evidence about Trump-Russia collusion wasn't just incorrect or someone who ought to be debated, but was somebody who was treasonous or a Kremlin agent or things like that. That's the prevailing tactic. So if you're somebody who was questioning lockdowns, it didn't just mean that you were incorrectly weighing the various metrics about the cost of a depression versus the cost of a pandemic in terms of human life and suffering. It meant that you were just a selfish, sociopathic person who didn't value the lives of old people, or you were some kind of, fascist who just simply thought that you didn't have to abide by government decrees. And so when you use those kind of tactics, when you deploy those kind of tactics against people, it's very difficult to resist, because your arguments aren't just being challenged, but you yourself are being widely condemned by this kind of, mob on social media of people with big platforms in journalism and politics. And then the same thing happened where if you questioned the coronavirus implications of these anti-police brutality protests, you were deemed a racist. Who wants to stick their head up and do that? And one of the things I really worry about, aside from, yeah, I do think about all these people who were barred from like being with their loved ones at the end of their lives because they were told that they can't risk going outside, or being at funerals, who are now watching hundreds of thousands of people go out into the street, one on top of the other, being applauded by the very same people who told that. I also worry, you know, as being someone in Brazil where the epidemiological curve is still increasing, how do you convince Brazilians to ignore Bolsonaro and, you know, other of his fanatical ideologues when they say you need to stay at home, when they're seeing these huge protests in New York and Los Angeles and Paris and Amsterdam and all over the world? It's sending the signal that actually none of that was really true, that people are free to disregard it. And I do wonder what the health costs are going to be from all of those.
Yeah.
Well, and what is the reality? So not with the spin, but what is the reality of, are we likely to see a spike? Is this likely to lead to more deaths so that people, I mean, not that any of us are epidemiological experts, but based on the data that we have, what do we know about how contagious and how deadly this disease actually is, so that we can appropriately gauge the risk of going out and protesting? And by the way, look, on this show, I mean, I didn't support the anti-lockdown protesters' viewpoint, right? They didn't share my viewpoint, but, you know, we tried very hard here to understand their perspective and not condemn them for that. We also tried not to like hyperventilate over pool parties and things like that. But how should people actually be weighing and assessing the risk?
Well, the coronavirus is very real, and it's fatal. And even when it's not fatal, it's very crippling to vital organs, to just your organism as a whole. Even people who recover from it months later are still debilitated and still suffering. You know, and I think that particularly the places that the protests are flourishing most, namely large cities, are the ones most vulnerable. I mean, it was New York that was the epicenter of COVID-19 for the United States. And here in Brazil, it's cities where there are huge, you know, populations of poor people living in great density, one on top of the next, where the virus is spreading most rapidly. And, you know, Brazil, for example, just almost reached 1,500 deaths in the last 24 hours. It's starting to reach the level of the United States, even though it's a country that has about 100 million people fewer than the United States does. So clearly, I've always taken the coronavirus threat very seriously. I thought there should be space for questioning whether the measures that are being enacted or implemented to safeguard against them were too extreme or not adequately recognizing the cost on the other side of the ledger. But I hope we're not at the point in the name of these protests where obviously the underlying cause is valid, and not just in terms of protesting George Floyd's murder, but the broader pathology of police brutality, notwithstanding the fact that the cause is just. I hope we're not at the point where now we're going to engage in denialism over the coronavirus and say, oh, it's not actually that big of a deal. It's not really as threatening as we thought. It only affects old people. Because none of that's true. And the data overwhelmingly demonstrates that. And even if it does, quote, only affect old people or people with comorbidities, who do you think the people on the streets protesting live with? They go back home to their parents and their grandparents. They interact with people who are in risk groups all the time. So unless the entire scientific consensus that we've all been forced to accept, and that I do accept based on my own analysis of the facts, is completely fraudulent, that we've heard the last 5 months, of course these protests are going to cause a serious spike in coronavirus cases and mortality. It has to.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. And Glenn, I mean, just last thing here. You're a civil libertarian. You're one of the activists known and has been involved in cases in causes like this for decades. How do you think about balancing protest movements, that's something you obviously sympathize with the coronavirus risk?
I mean, I've been very concerned from the beginning about the coronavirus in a number of respects, particularly the fact, ironically enough, that the way in which we were all being confined to our homes with no end in sight indefinitely would strengthen government institutions and empower centers, because going out on the street and protesting is a really important way that citizens check governments. And if we're barred from being able to do that because we're all locked at home, that's a really dangerous state of affairs, because governments know they can get away with a lot of things that maybe previously they weren't able to get away with. I also have been increasingly concerned about things like curfews and lockdowns and the use of a police force to prevent people from gathering outside, even responsibly, from deciding what risks to take. Because originally the argument was we need to do this to flatten the curve to prevent the medical system or the hospital system from collapsing. But even once that became managed in over most places, the repressive measures continued of surveillance, of curfews, of lockdowns. And so the civil libertarian concerns of how this public health crisis is managed has become increasingly concerning to me as a civil libertarian, as I see a mismatch or a cleavage between the rationale on the one hand and the realities of what governments are doing on the other.
Yeah. Glenn, one last question on that, actually. Taking coronavirus out of it, we seem to have gotten very comfortable in this country with the institution of curfews, right? I mean, curfews at 1 p.m., curfews at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 8 p.m., 11 p.m., whatever it is. How should we be thinking about those things? Because to me, I'm not saying that curfews should never be instituted, but I think this is a very weighty thing that should be considered very cautiously and only instituted in the sort of most dramatic and draconian of circumstances.
Yeah, I think this last 10 days has been very educative, very illuminating about what kind of society the United States really is. Because there's this iconic quote from the socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg, who said, if you don't move, you don't notice your chains. So you can have tyranny and repression in a police state, but if you don't have people threatening power centers, threatening the government, marching in mass, it's very easy to forget that it even is there because it's not being deployed, because the citizenry is obedient and acquiescent. So what you see over the last 10 days is a citizenry that's not obedient and acquiescent. They're protesting, they're engaging in civil disobedience, they're assembling in great numbers. And what you're seeing is this police force being unleashed that really is a paramilitarized police force. And you realize that a lot of the kind of hallmarks of authoritarianism, like curfews, like what we were talking about at the beginning, just a citizenry that swallows whatever they're told instantly from authorities without questioning it, to the point that they can be dragged from believing one thing to the exact opposite literally overnight, is kind of just faded into the woodwork of American political culture, even though we like to think of ourselves as these like hardened, individualists and these rugged, liberty-protecting citizens. It is an authoritarian culture, probably because of 9/11 and the climate that got created there. But even before that, and I think we're just seeing the reality of that now that's actually always been there.
Yeah. Although certainly you see a lot of people who are feeling those chains right now and are, pushing the boundaries.
Because they're moving. Because they're moving.
Because they're moving. Exactly right. Glenn, it's always so great to have your insights on this. Great to see you.
Thank you,
Good to be
Glenn.
with you guys. Thanks. All right, bye.
See you later.